When we met, I thought I'd found the one. I was 25 and dizzy with hope. She was bold, the kind of person who'd drag you onto the dance floor when your legs felt like lead, and I fell hard. That first night, we were at a friend's wedding, and she pulled me from my corner, right into the spotlight with her. She laughed when I tried to keep up, her eyes bright with the thrill of the moment. I was all in from that night forward. Years later, there was a day I stood in our small, shared kitchen, wondering how we'd gotten so far from that night. The sunlight was sharp through the window, like it was drawing all the lines I didn't want to see. We'd just had another fight, this time over something as trivial as who'd left the laundry in the washer. That was the first time it struck me, cold and hard. Maybe we weren't meant to last. And yet, I could still see a glimmer of who we'd been in her face, just enough to make me question everything. But love feels different when you're bracing yourself for the next argument, doesn't it? Like you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, to shatter whatever fragile piece you've managed to piece together. It didn't help that her job became more demanding, and she started spending weekends away for work events. I tried to understand. After all, I'd known she was ambitious from day one. But after a while, I began to feel like a ghost in my own relationship, waiting on her time and her terms. The day I finally snapped, we'd just come back from a family dinner, one where we barely spoke to each other. I'd been careful with my words, not wanting to rock the boat, but when I asked her what was really going on, she brushed me off, said she was tired. And there it was, the boiling point. "If you're tired of me, just say so," I said. That night, it felt like a dam broke. She confessed she wasn't happy, and hadn't been for a while. "You think I'm happy?" I asked, laughing bitterly. We laid out years of unspoken resentments, the things we'd let fester. She hated how clingy I could be, how I wanted so much time together. I hated how she pulled away when I needed her most. It was painful, and by the end I felt stripped bare. We went to bed separately that night, and neither of us said a word about what we'd laid out. The hardest part was, I still remembered the good times. I could still picture the Sunday mornings we'd spent sprawled on the couch with coffee, our laughter echoing through our tiny apartment. She'd sit on my lap, stealing my toast, and then my attention, telling me silly stories about her week. We'd cook together on Fridays, her playlist on, and it'd be like we were in our own little world. I remembered every detail, and that made it worse. I'd fallen for her bright energy, her uncontainable spark. But over the years, that light seemed to have dimmed, and neither of us could find a way to reignite it. After our kitchen confrontation, we both tried. Half-heartedly, maybe, but we tried. We made a deal to spend more time together, took a weekend trip to a cabin out of town to reconnect. I remember sitting by the fire, watching her scroll on her phone, half listening to my stories, as if we'd fallen into a script we didn't want to be in. She'd say, "I love you," with this far-off look, and I'd wonder if she even knew what she was saying anymore. We even tried seeing a counselor, but every session turned into more arguments, more unhealed wounds that were too deep to ignore. I knew I couldn't keep trying to fill a gap that felt like an abyss, but I also wasn't ready to let her go. Maybe I'd invested too much of myself into this vision of our life together. I convinced myself that we just had to try harder, like love was a puzzle we could solve if we could just stop getting in our own way. But in the end, it felt like we were just digging deeper into a hole. The day we decided to call it quits was surreal. We didn't have another huge fight. There was no final straw this time. We just sat down in our living room, each of us on opposite ends of the couch, like two strangers waiting for a bus. It was quiet, like we both knew what was coming but didn't want to be the first to say it. I remember staring at the coffee table, looking at a mug she'd gotten me years ago that said, "Forever yours," feeling a sad sort of irony. "I think this is it," I finally said, my voice sounding foreign. She nodded, and just like that, we knew. The emptiness that followed was worse than I'd expected. She moved out the next week, and our apartment felt haunted with her absence. Her laughter, the music she used to play too loud, even her piles of half-read books, it all left with her. I couldn't even look at the couch without thinking of those lazy mornings, without feeling this ache that gnawed at me, asking if I could have done more. I kept wondering if maybe I'd overreacted, if this loneliness was worse than the arguments had been. Friends would check in, some saying I'd dodged a bullet, others saying, "You'll find someone who really appreciates you." But their words felt hollow because I wasn't ready to move on. I spent nights replaying our memories, torn between anger and sadness, between regret and relief. There was this hollow in my chest that I couldn't fill, no matter how many new hobbies I tried or how often I forced myself out with friends. I took up running, tried learning guitar, anything to keep busy. But every time I came back to my empty apartment, it all hit me again. I'd find myself looking at old photos, torturing myself with the ghost of who we'd been. Months passed, and I still wasn't sure I'd done the right thing. Some days, I'd catch myself walking past a bakery she loved or hearing a song that had once been ours, and it'd feel like I was right back in those moments, missing her all over again. I'd wonder if I was doomed to carry that part of her with me, to hold on to this quiet pain forever. Sometimes, it felt like she was a phantom that lingered just out of reach, reminding me of what I'd lost. People tell you that time heals all wounds, but they don't tell you how slow it is, how each day you have to wake up and remind yourself why you left, why you couldn't stay. I'm learning to live with the empty spaces, to find new rhythms, even if they don't feel quite right yet. I've started seeing a therapist, talking through all those things I never said, the pieces of myself I'd buried in the relationship. And maybe that's the hardest part, not just losing her, but finding me again. So, here I am, piecing myself back together, day by day. And maybe that's where I'll find the strength I've been searching for. For anyone out there who's been through this, how did you cope? What helped you finally move on? I remember going on a date with this girl who seemed perfect on paper. We'd been chatting for a few weeks, and she was always witty and quick with comebacks, something I really appreciate. When we finally met in person, I was excited to see if the chemistry would hold up. I'll never forget the first thing she said when she saw me. "Oh, I thought you'd be taller." Now, I'm not particularly short. I'm 5 feet 9 inches, but that comment just took the wind out of my sails. I tried to laugh it off and told her, "Well, you look exactly as you did in your photos." No surprises there. She half smiled, but I could tell she wasn't fully present. Dinner felt like an interrogation. She'd ask a question and then look around the restaurant like she was waiting for someone better to walk in. I'd be mid-sentence trying to keep the conversation going, and she'd cut in with, "Yeah, so what car do you drive?" Like my answer would make or break the night. I kept my cool, hoping it was just nerves on her part, but when the check came, she didn't even make the slightest gesture to contribute. Not even a thank you. I figured fine, maybe she's just old school, and I didn't mind treating, but the kicker came as we walked out. She turned to me and said, "Next time, could you wear something more put together?" I was stunned. Here I was trying to make a connection, and she was rating my fashion sense like I was a contestant on some reality show. That was the last time I put effort into dating someone who clearly didn't see me as more than a checklist. It taught me that sometimes people aren't looking for a person, they're looking for an image. I met this woman through a mutual friend, and she seemed really sweet and down to earth. Our first few dates were great. She'd talk about her love for hiking and how she'd spent the last year working on herself, getting over a toxic relationship. I admired that about her. She was open and honest. Things went well until our 5th date. Out of nowhere, she pulled out her phone at dinner, and I figured she was checking a text or something. But no, she just sat there scrolling through Instagram while I tried to make conversation. Every now and then, she'd show me a post, barely looking up from her screen. It got worse when she started recording a dinner date vlog without even asking if I was cool with it. Halfway through dinner, she looked me dead in the eye and said, I think I'm finally ready to commit." I was stunned. I hadn't even thought we were at that level. And here she was talking about commitment, while ignoring me for Instagram. She continued talking about how she'd been burned before, how guys had ghosted her, and how she felt it was finally time to settle down. But every time I responded, she seemed barely interested, like she just needed to say those things out loud for her own benefit. By the end of the night, I realized she wasn't looking for a partner. She was looking for someone to fill a role in her happily ever after narrative, and I was just a prop. I told her I didn't think we were a match, and I swear, she barely looked up from her phone as I walked away. That night was when I understood that, for some people, dating is less about connection and more about validation. This one date took place right after a rough breakup. I was nervous, but decided to give it a shot since my friends insisted that I get back out there. We met for coffee, and the date seemed nice at first. She was sweet, seemed genuinely interested, and laughed at my jokes. It felt refreshing to be around someone positive, and for a moment I thought maybe things could work out. But then, as we got into a deeper conversation, she started talking about her ex. At first, it was just a casual mention, but as she went on, it turned into this detailed story of how he'd wronged her, how much she still resented him, and how she was only dating to make him jealous. I tried to shift the topic back to something lighter, but she kept steering the conversation back to her past, almost like she needed a witness to her grievances. She kept saying things like, "Do you think it's fair that he just left like that? And what would you do if someone just ghosted you after 3 years?" At one point, she asked me to take a selfie with her so she could show him she's moved on. I felt trapped. I didn't want to hurt her feelings by leaving abruptly, but I also didn't sign up to be a pawn in someone's revenge game. The date ended, and she thanked me for being so understanding, but I walked away feeling more alone than I had before. That experience taught me that some people aren't ready to move on. They're just trying to find someone to share their bitterness. I met Alex on a cool autumn night at a friend's gathering, where the air smelled like with smoke and laughter. We connected right away, drawn to each other like magnets. He had that easy charm that instantly put people at ease, and when he focused on me, it was like the world faded into the background. I remember sitting with him on the porch, his warm smile making me feel like I'd stumbled upon someone special, someone who truly got me. That night, we talked for hours about dreams, fears, and life's what-ifs. He seemed deeply insightful and so empathetic. For someone like me, who'd always felt a bit misunderstood, Alex felt like a gift. In those early days, he was everything I thought I'd been waiting for. He'd surprise me with little notes tucked into my bag, send thoughtful texts out of the blue, and would listen, really listen, when I shared anything about my day. He had this ability to make me feel seen and heard like no one ever had. Whenever I felt down, Alex was there, ready with comforting words and open arms. It all felt so right, so easy. I kept thinking, this is how a relationship is supposed to feel. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things started to change. The signs were subtle at first, so minor that I convinced myself they weren't signs at all. It began with small requests, asking me to spend more time with him, which I assumed was just his way of showing he cared. He'd say things like, "I just love being with you so much," or "You make everything better." Who wouldn't want to feel that important to someone? But then, spending more time started to mean changing my plans to fit his. He'd ask me to cancel on friends, urging me to stay in because he couldn't stand being away from me. I remember one night, I mentioned going to a friend's party, and his face darkened. He insisted he didn't mind if I went, but would follow it with a long, heavy silence that made it clear he wanted me to stay with him. Slowly, without realizing it, I started altering my life to avoid those silences, that underlying tension. My world, once bright and wide, began to shrink until it was mostly Alex. His concern grew into something stifling. He'd call and text constantly, checking in, asking where I was or who I was with. At first, I told myself he was just attentive, maybe a little protective. But the question started to feel more invasive, more like surveillance than love. One night, I went out with a few friends, and he showed up at the bar just to check on me. I thought it was odd, but he played it off, saying he just missed me and felt uneasy. And I believed him because, well, I wanted to believe him. I ignored that strange feeling in my gut, telling myself he was just caring. Surely there was nothing wrong with that. Things started to escalate. Alex's mood swings became erratic. One moment he'd be affectionate, praising me, telling me how lucky he was. The next he'd snap over the smallest things. If I didn't respond to his text right away, he'd accuse me of ignoring him or imply I didn't care as much as he did. He'd say things like, "I'd drop anything for you, and it's clear you don't feel the same." I'd try to explain, try to soothe him, but the tiniest misstep would set him off. His face would twist in anger, his voice raising until I felt like a scolded child. But then, almost as quickly, he'd become gentle again, apologizing, promising he'd work on it, saying he'd just been stressed. I began to feel like I was living on an emotional roller coaster, never quite sure which version of Alex I was going to get. I'd be lying if I said I didn't start to feel responsible, wondering what I could do to keep him happy and keep things calm. I told myself I just needed to be more understanding, more patient. When he'd accuse me of never listening or say things like, "If you really cared, you'd try harder," I'd nod and apologize, convinced I was the one failing. In those dark moments, doubt crept in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't attentive enough. I started questioning everything I did, every word I said. I stopped talking to my friends about it because I worried they'd think I was overreacting, or worse, that they'd agree it was my fault. I even caught myself wondering if I was too flawed to deserve the kind of love I'd once imagined. But I clung to those early memories, the way he'd made me feel in the beginning, convinced if I could just do things right, we'd get back to that. One night, after yet another argument that left me feeling hollow, I stumbled across an article online about toxic relationships. I started reading about things like gaslighting, emotional manipulation, and control tactics. It felt like someone had been secretly watching my life and documenting every painful moment. The words hit hard, as though a mirror was suddenly being held up to all the doubts and excuses I'd been living with. For the first time, I saw his behavior for what it was: controlling, manipulative, toxic. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me wanted to believe he could change, that this realization would somehow make everything okay. But the other part of me, the part that had started to feel like a shadow of my former self, knew this couldn't go on. I reached out to a friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in weeks, and poured out everything. She listened, no judgment, just quiet support. When I finally fell silent, she asked, "Why are you still with him?" I didn't have an answer. I knew I was scared of what life without him would look like, of facing the world alone after investing so much in him. But I was also starting to realize that staying was costing me something far greater: my sense of self, my happiness, my peace of mind. Now, I find myself at a crossroads. Part of me knows I need to leave, that I deserve better, but the other part still clings to the idea of the man he was in the beginning, the man who made me feel so special. I'm terrified of the unknown, of walking away and wondering if I gave up too soon. So, I'm asking you, Reddit, has anyone else been in a toxic relationship like this? How did you know it was time to leave, and where did you find the strength to take that first step? It was the summer before college, and my best friend, Jake, threw one last blowout before we all went our separate ways. His parents were out of town, and the house was packed with old friends, newer friends, and a decent-sized crowd of people I'd never even seen before. I'd known Jake since grade school, and his mom, Denise, was the definition of a cool mom. She was funny, lively, never too strict, and always the life of the neighborhood gatherings. That night, however, she wasn't supposed to be there. She'd gone on a mini trip with Jake's dad, but as luck would have it, they returned unexpectedly in the middle of the party. Jake rushed to the door to greet them, but I stayed back in the crowd, hoping to avoid the inevitable conversation about how he wasn't supposed to have people over. The crowd started thinning out once his parents were home, with Jake and his dad trying to diplomatically clear everyone out without starting World War III. I wasn't the first to leave, but as one of Jake's oldest friends, I decided to stay and help clean up. A few of us gathered empty beer bottles and tried to make the place look a little more presentable. Denise, surprisingly, was in a great mood. "You guys sure had quite a party," she laughed, grabbing some plastic cups off the coffee table. "I'm just glad no one set the backyard on fire." Once Jake's dad went to bed, Denise lingered, helping us pick up the last of the trash and sharing a couple of funny stories about her own wild high school parties. She looked different that night. Maybe it was the slight buzz from the drink she nursed, or just the warmth in her laugh. I couldn't tell, but something about her presence felt electric. Soon it was just Denise and me left. Jake had gone to bed after saying a quick, "Thanks, man," and Denise suggested we sit on the porch for some fresh air. The house was quiet, and the stars were bright against the night sky. We sat down on the porch steps, and she poured a bit more wine for herself, laughing as she caught me looking. "Don't worry, I'm done mothering for the night," she joked. We got talking, really talking. She told me about her first road trip with friends, how she'd snuck out of her parents' house when she was 16. Somehow, the conversation shifted to how she'd met Jake's dad and how they'd been high school sweethearts. There was a bittersweetness in her tone, as if she were sifting through memories both precious and slightly painful. I was surprised at how candid she was, not at all like the version of her I'd known over the years. Eventually, she went quiet, looking up at the stars, her hand resting close enough to mine that I felt the warmth of her skin. When I turned to say something, she looked directly at me, and there was a glint in her eyes that didn't feel like a friendly glint. I stammered something awkwardly, but she just smiled and said, "It's okay. You don't have to say anything." Before I realized it, she leaned in and kissed me, a soft, quick brush of her lips as if testing the water. I froze, feeling my heart race and my mind go blank. She pulled back just a little, watching me closely, and without fully understanding why, I leaned in and kissed her back. The kiss deepened, and suddenly everything felt surreal, wrong but electrifying. After a few breathless moments, she pulled back. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between disbelief and exhilaration. "Maybe we should go inside," she whispered, and I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We made our way inside quietly, trying not to wake anyone. Once in the living room, she seemed to reconsider, looking almost as if she might say something to stop this. But then, with a quick glance around, she took my hand and led me to the guest room at the back of the house. Every part of me knew I should stop, but I didn't. The night was a mix of adrenaline, nerves, and a kind of strange, thrilling connection I couldn't ignore. We spent the night together, talking softly in the dark afterward, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this fragile, secret moment. Around 4 a.m., she slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with a mess of emotions: guilt, excitement, confusion. I didn't sleep a wink, and when morning came, I felt a deep, hollow sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I was out of there before Jake woke up, mumbling an excuse about a family thing I needed to get to. Denise gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod as I walked past her, and I felt a twinge of something I couldn't put into words. Over the next few weeks, I tried to shove the memory down, lock it away as best as I could. I hung out with Jake a few times, and things seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every time I saw Denise, there was something just beneath the surface. A quick glance, a pause in her smile. We both knew something had changed between us, and even though we never spoke of it, the silence seemed louder than any words could have been. One evening, a month or so later, I got a text from her. "Need to talk. Can we meet somewhere?" My heart dropped. I didn't know if this was going to be the moment she told me she regretted it, that I needed to stay away, or she wanted to continue whatever strange, unspoken connection we'd fallen into. We met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, somewhere no one we knew would see us. She was wearing a sweater, her hair pulled back, looking far more reserved than that night on the porch. We sat there in silence for a moment before she finally said, "Look, I think we both know that what happened, well, it shouldn't have happened." I nodded, unsure of what to say. She went on, her voice soft, almost regretful. "I don't regret it, not really, but I don't want this to complicate things. Jake doesn't deserve that, and neither do you." She looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and warmth, and for a second, I wondered what things might have been like if the world were different, if we weren't tangled up in a web of people who mattered. I agreed, knowing she was right, and we both walked away that day without looking back. But even now, years later, the memory lingers, a reminder of a night that felt like a dream, like stepping into someone else's life just for a moment. Jake and I drifted apart eventually, as friends do when life pulls them in different directions, but the memory of that night, of Denise's laugh under the stars, of her hand brushing against mine, stays with me, an unspoken chapter of a life that wasn't meant to be. In some ways, it feels like a secret I've kept from the world, like a ghost that haunts the edges of my memory. I wonder if Denise ever thinks about it, if she remembers that night as vividly as I do, or if, for her, it was simply a strange moment she's long since put to rest. Either way, I doubt I'll ever forget her, or that night we both decided to cross a line we couldn't uncross. When I first met Jake, it felt like I'd stumbled into one of those rare cinematic loves. You know, the kind they make movies about. We met at a friend's dinner party, and he stood out right away, charming, attentive, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. I remember feeling this intense excitement and relief all at once. It seemed like finally I'd met someone who was different from everyone else I'd dated. He was smart, funny, and above all kind. The first few months were blissful, and I often caught myself wondering how I got so lucky. Jake would surprise me with little notes, messages, or flowers just because. He was so attuned to my emotions, too. Always asking about my day, listening deeply, and offering the kind of support I'd craved but never found in past relationships. My friends and family noticed, too, and would comment on how he seemed to genuinely cherish me. For the first time in my life, I felt completely seen and valued. But after a few months, there were subtle shifts. I remember the first time I noticed a crack in the perfect surface of our relationship. One evening, I mentioned that I was meeting up with my best friend, Lena, for coffee after work. Jake's reaction was immediate and surprisingly intense. He asked why I didn't invite him along, and when I said it was just a little catch-up between Lena and me, he went quiet. I could feel his disappointment, though he barely said a word about it. Later that night, he made a comment that stuck with me. "It just seems like you'd rather spend time with other people than with me." At the time, I brushed it off as insecurity. I'd had insecurities myself before, so I reassured him, promised we'd have a weekend together, and told myself it wasn't a big deal. But then, things started happening more often. When I would make plans with friends or have to work late, Jake would get noticeably upset. He never yelled or accused me outright, but he'd make these small, loaded comments like, "I just wish I was important enough for you to prioritize me." They made me feel like I was somehow letting him down or failing him. It became a pattern. Anytime I wanted to do something on my own or with someone else, Jake would go quiet, withdrawn, or make me feel like I'd hurt him. I started noticing how I was changing my plans without even realizing it, adjusting to what I thought would make him happy. Soon, I stopped mentioning most social outings altogether, finding it easier to avoid the tension altogether. One weekend, I was supposed to visit my family, who lived a few hours away. I'd planned it weeks in advance, and Jake knew about it. But the night before I was supposed to leave, he suddenly seemed down and preoccupied. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "Nothing, I thought this weekend we could have time to ourselves. But it's okay. Go be with your family." The guilt was so heavy I almost canceled. And when I did finally go, I spent the entire time feeling anxious, texting him, trying to make sure he wasn't upset. The shift was so gradual, I barely noticed it happening. But looking back, that's when I started to feel trapped. I was constantly on edge, watching his mood and making sure I didn't do anything to trigger disappointment or that quiet, painful silence. Even my close friends were beginning to feel distant because I'd stopped seeing them or confiding in them. Jake would ask subtle, probing questions like, "What did you two talk about?" Or, "You didn't tell them about us, did you?" I began to second-guess myself and doubt the intentions of everyone around me, just as he did. As his control grew, so did his criticisms. He would comment on my clothes, suggesting that some outfits were too much or not really my style. He questioned why I followed certain people on social media, even convinced me to delete a few because, in his words, "Why would you want that kind of energy around you?" At first, I accepted his words as advice, thinking maybe he was just looking out for me. But soon, every little thing I did seemed to invite his disapproval. One night, I showed him a story I'd written, just a hobby, nothing serious. Writing was my passion, a small piece of myself I kept separate from my day-to-day life, and I thought he'd understand that. But instead, he picked it apart, saying it wasn't as good as some of the things he'd read before, that maybe I needed to work on my style. It hurt more than I expected, and I stopped writing altogether after that. It was like I was losing pieces of myself, one at a time. I didn't even realize how isolated I'd become until Lena texted me, asking if everything was all right because she hadn't seen me in weeks. And that was when it hit me. I'd been avoiding her, avoiding everyone who might have noticed that something was wrong. When I brought it up to Jake, he acted wounded and defensive, insisting he only wanted the best for me. "I just want us to be close," he said. "I want to protect you from people who don't understand us." The worst part was that a piece of me believed him. I'd become so wrapped up in his version of love that I couldn't tell if I was overreacting or if he was right. There were moments when I wanted to leave, But every time, he'd say something to draw me back in, a quiet apology, an admission of his own fears, a promise to work on things. And I'd think, maybe I'm just being dramatic. Maybe he really does love me. But inside, I was slowly breaking down. I could barely recognize myself in the mirror anymore. I was constantly anxious, self-conscious, and unable to make even the smallest decisions without worrying how Jake would react. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own life, and that realization shook me deeply. I started wondering how I'd let it get this far. I loved him, or at least I thought I did, but at what cost? Now I'm here, pouring my story out to strangers on the internet, because, honestly, I don't know what to do. Every time I try to take a step back, I feel this wave of guilt and confusion, and I question if I even have the right to feel this way. I keep thinking, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe if I just tried a little harder, things could go back to how they were. So I guess that's my question. How do you find the strength to leave when the person you love is also the one hurting you? How did you know it was time to finally let go? There was this time at a little art gallery, one of those tucked away places with abstract sculptures and dim lighting. I'm standing there, admiring this totally bizarre piece, something that looked like a melting tree crossed with a spider. Anyway, this guy sidles up next to me and, without missing a beat, says, "Do you think this artist is trying to tell us to avoid spiders or hug trees?" I couldn't help but laugh, partly because it was a ridiculous question, but also because he'd found a way to make the situation fun without forcing a conversation. I just rolled with it, something like, "I'd rather hug a spider than whatever that is." He laughs, genuinely, and adds, "Maybe it's a warning for when our projects go horribly wrong." We ended up talking about our wild interpretations of the art around us, not about where I was from or if I was single. I knew he was interested, but he didn't push it. He let it be about the art, the shared laughs, the what on earth is that moments. By the end, he said, "Well, if you ever want a gallery buddy to help decipher more abstract nightmares, I'm around." It was funny and low pressure, which is rare. He wasn't trying to impress. He was just there, present, and not weirdly intense about it. It was refreshing, and you know what? I actually ended up texting him a week later to see if he'd like to decipher some more horribly wrong art. The best part? I got to feel like it was my decision, not something he was pushing on me. Now for a complete opposite. I once had a guy walk up to me at a grocery store, of all places, while I was picking out melons. He looks at me, then down at the melons in my hands, and says, "Need any help with that?" In this tone that made it very clear he was not talking about fruit. I just stared at him for a second, my brain catching up to the audacity, before giving him a flat no thanks. He laughs, kind of awkwardly, and goes, "Just kidding, but I'd love to get your number." It was painful. Instead of taking the hint, he followed me halfway down the aisle, trying to make more awkward jokes about fruits, and I just kept ignoring him. Look, if I'm not even glancing back, don't keep pushing it. Approaching someone isn't a problem in itself, but the persistence and complete lack of awareness when there's no interest, that's what takes it from maybe to please leave me alone. A decent guy would have backed off, maybe left it with a simple, "Well, nice to meet you." But instead, he kept following me through the aisles, making what he probably thought were charming comments, and by the end, it was just creepy. Honestly, nothing screams, no louder than a person steadily moving away from you without looking back. Another time, a guy approached me in the most unexpected yet, strangely, most appreciated way. I was at a friend's outdoor barbecue, just trying to make myself look busy at the grill so I wouldn't have to small talk with anyone I didn't know well. This guy comes over and stands beside me, not saying anything for a good minute, just watching me fiddle with the coals. Then he goes, "So, are you as uncomfortable as I am right now?" I actually laughed because, yeah, it was obvious we were both trying not to feel like social outcasts. I replied, trying to avoid small talk. "You?" He nodded, relieved, and said, "Completely." But here we are, doing exactly that. What made this approach work was his honesty. He didn't try to come off as smooth or super confident. He just acknowledged how awkward these social gatherings could be. We ended up talking about all the things people do to avoid mingling, pretending to be glued to their phones, staring into their drinks, and of course, getting lost on the way to the bathroom. By the end of the night, I didn't even realize we'd spent half of it just talking. And it was fun. He wasn't overbearing, didn't try to steer the conversation in a million different directions, and most importantly, didn't turn it into a chase. It was real, it was easy, and it led to us hanging out a few more times after that. It's not that complicated. The best approaches are the ones that make me feel like a person, not a prize to be won, and definitely not like I'm a part of someone's checklist for the day. If I look at you and feel like I'm talking to a normal human, not someone with a master plan, that's when you have my attention. If you're willing to just enjoy a moment without forcing an outcome, that's what actually leaves an impression. It started with something small like these things usually do. I was telling my partner, Sarah, about my workday, a few funny mishaps, a new project I was stressed about. It wasn't a big deal, just stuff I wanted to get off my chest. Somewhere in the middle of my story, she picked up her phone and started scrolling. I felt this weird pang, like my words were just hanging in the air, barely noticed. "Did you hear what I said?" I asked, half laughing to hide that I was actually feeling ignored. She looked up surprised. "Yeah, you were just talking about work, right? Right, but like actually listening?" She rolled her eyes and put the phone down, muttering, "It's not like it was anything serious." That stung. I know it wasn't a groundbreaking conversation, but that wasn't the point. I needed her to just be there, to care about what I'm saying, even if it's just mundane stuff. But every time I tried to explain that it hurt, she'd shrug and say, "Well, I listen to you when it matters." And maybe that's where the rift began. I kept brushing it off, telling myself not to be so sensitive. But over the next few weeks, this pattern crept into every corner of our relationship. We'd make dinner plans, and I'd suggest a new place I thought she'd like. She'd make a face or mumble something dismissive, like she was barely considering what I said. When I asked her if she'd rather go somewhere else, she'd shrug. "Doesn't matter to me." And we'd end up eating somewhere she liked, while I'd sit across from her, feeling like my preferences didn't even register. Or take our conversations at home. Small stuff like if we talk about what show to watch. I'd mention a series I thought was interesting, only for her to brush it off because it didn't look her type. But if she suggested something, I'd always at least give it a shot. I started noticing these little moments piling up. All these times I felt dismissed, unheard, or outright ignored. When I tried to bring it up, how it felt like she wasn't interested in what I thought or how I felt, she'd usually brush it off. "You're overthinking again. It's not like I don't care," she'd say, like that should be the end of it. Eventually, even basic communication became a battleground. The simplest things would turn into disagreements, each of us misunderstanding the other. It'd start with something like me asking if she could let me know when she'd be back from work if she was running late. She took it as me trying to control her schedule. I tried to explain it was just so I could plan our dinner, but she'd wave it off, saying I was making too big a deal out of it. Every discussion would get derailed by defensiveness or jokes to avoid getting serious. It got to a point where I felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid that anything I said would either get ignored or twisted into an argument. I'd find myself going over conversations in my head, wondering if I was saying things wrong, if I was somehow causing these reactions by over-explaining or pushing too hard. One night, after another long argument over something ridiculously minor, she forgot to pick up milk and got defensive when I asked why she didn't let me know. I lay in bed just staring at the ceiling, wondering what we were doing. Was I being unfair? Was I expecting too much? Or were we simply on different wavelengths, and no amount of talking was going to bridge that gap? I started wondering if we were even compatible. She could sit through hours of conversation with her friends, listen to every detail of their lives, laugh and sympathize. But with me, it was like she only had half the patience, like everything I said was just another thing to be brushed aside. It hurt, and the more it happened, the less I felt like opening up. I didn't feel safe talking to her, so I just started bottling things up. That led to even more tension. I'd come home, and if she asked how my day went, I'd mumble, "Fine," even when I'd had the roughest day. She'd sense I was being distant, and I could see it irritated her, but I didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try anymore, because I'd already convinced myself that no matter how many times I'd try to explain, it'd just be another round of "you're overthinking" or "it's not that deep." Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided we needed to have a serious talk, one where I could lay everything out. I wanted her to see how this pattern was affecting me, affecting us. I planned everything I'd say, hoping that if I approached it calmly, maybe she'd actually understand. So one Friday evening, I sat her down. I told her I needed to talk, that it was important. She looked a bit nervous but agreed to listen. I started explaining, carefully, how I felt like I wasn't being heard, like my feelings didn't matter as much as hers. I tried to make it clear that I wasn't accusing her, just trying to share my experience. As I went on, though, I saw her expression change. Her face hardened, and I could tell she was getting defensive. Before I could finish, she cut me off. "So, you're saying I'm a terrible girlfriend?" she asked, her voice sharp. "No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just trying to tell you how I feel." "But that's what it sounds like," she snapped. "It sounds like everything I do is wrong." I took a deep breath, trying not to get pulled into another pointless argument. "Sarah, please. This isn't about blaming you. It's about finding a way for us to understand each other." She crossed her arms, shaking her head. "I feel like you're making a big deal out of nothing. I mean, I don't complain about every little thing you do." At that point, I felt something inside me just break. I realized that no matter how many ways I tried to explain it, no matter how carefully I chose my words, she'd only ever see it as criticism. I wasn't sure if I could keep doing this, keep feeling this lonely in a relationship that was supposed to be about partnership. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I wondered if I was wasting my time. I questioned if this was how relationships were supposed to be, or if maybe I was the problem, if maybe I was just too sensitive or too needy. Part of me felt guilty for even considering that leaving might be the only way to stop feeling so invisible. So here I am, torn between staying and trying to fix something that feels like it's breaking me, or walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. Is there any way to improve communication in this kind of situation? How do you handle it when you feel like every conversation is just another chance to be misunderstood? I'll start by saying I never thought I'd be the kind of person to turn to Reddit for advice. But here I am, feeling like I'm caught in some hazy, indecisive fog I can't see my way out of. It feels strange to put my love life out here, but I'm hoping someone out there might help me make sense of it. Last Thursday, we went to our usual spot, the little Italian place down the street. It was a place full of our memories, birthdays, anniversaries, random date nights just because we felt like it. There was even a little corner booth that felt like ours. I still remember the first time we went there. We'd been dating for a month, and he insisted I try the tiramisu, feeding me the first bite while grinning like a fool. But this time was different. Instead of looking at me with that grin, he spent most of the night scrolling on his phone. Sure, he made a few comments about his workday and asked if I wanted to share a dessert, but it was almost like he was just there going through the motions. When he was there, I didn't feel like he was there. I tried to brush it off as a one-time thing. I figured he was just busy or maybe preoccupied with some work deadline. But that night set off an itch in my brain that's been hard to ignore. Because it's not just one night, one dinner. It's been 100 little things, tiny pieces of him slowly slipping away. It's the mornings when he used to pull me close, even half asleep, and murmur some goofy line to make me laugh before I'd barely open my eyes. Lately, though, he just gets up, sometimes so quietly I barely realize he's left the bed. I miss his stupid grin as he tried to make me smile before I'd had my coffee. And I miss the way he used to look at me like I was his first thought of the day, or the way he'd check in during the day. I can't count the number of random memes or silly inside jokes we'd send each other over lunch. But lately, my phone stays silent. No thinking of you texts, no little reminders that he's out there thinking about me. And yet, in between these quiet, unsettling shifts, he'll turn around and do something sweet, and it throws me completely off. Like just last week, he came home with my favorite tea, a brand I'd mentioned in passing that I hadn't had in years. "Saw this and thought of you," he said, giving me this little smile that felt like a drop of rain after a drought. I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe I was overthinking it all. But then, right after he handed it to me, he just drifted off. He went to his desk, plugged in his headphones, and was lost in his own world for the rest of the night. 1 minute he's distant, barely there. The next, he's doing something so thoughtful it knocks the wind out of me. It's messing with my head because I don't know which version is real. I keep swinging between feeling like everything's fine and thinking I must be losing him. The worst part is that I can't stop comparing everything to how it used to be. I think back to how we were at the start, the late night drives to nowhere, the way we'd stay up until 3 a.m. just talking about the randomest things. Even just last summer, we went on this amazing trip, and I still remember how he'd look at me across the campfire like I was his whole world. He was there, fully there with me. Now he seems like he's somewhere else, like he's half living in a place I can't reach. And I'm stuck wondering what's changed, wondering if it's something I did, or if it's just him. Maybe he's pulling away because of something in his life, or maybe he's just grown out of us, and he's too kind to say it. I don't know. I just keep replaying things in my head, searching for signs, for reasons, and it's eating me up. Finally, last night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. We were lying in bed, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing on my chest, this silent question filling the room. So I just said it. What's going on with us? He turned to me, and for a second, I thought I saw something raw in his eyes, a flicker of the person I knew so well. But then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck the way he does when he's trying to find the right words. I don't know, he said finally. I'm just going through a rough time. I don't know how to explain it. That was it. No details, no assurances. Just a vague answer that left me even more confused than before. I wanted to reach out, to dig deeper, to understand, but something in his tone told me not to push. So I let it go, even though I felt like screaming, even though every part of me was aching for some clarity, some certainty. So here I am, pouring my heart out to strangers on the internet. I don't know if this is just a phase, if he's just going through something he'll eventually let me into, or if this is the beginning of the end, if he's slipping away and there's nothing I can do to bring him back. How do you know if it's just a phase or something more serious? Has anyone else been through this? Because right now, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I don't understand, and I don't know if I should jump, hold on, or just let go. I remember the exact moment it all started to go wrong. It was a small, offhand comment that I thought would get a laugh, or at least a nod. We were sitting in the living room, relaxing after a long week. I just spent half an hour cooking, and as we sat down, I said, I think I could open a little food stand with this recipe. He looked at me, straight-faced, and said, "Do you really think you're that good?" The way he said it, like he genuinely doubted me, made something in me shrink. I laughed awkwardly, tried to play it off. "Just an idea," I said, but I felt myself closing up like a book. Inside, though, a hurt started growing, spreading its roots like a weed. After that, things started to shift. Small things here, and there seemed to mean more than they used to. Or maybe I was just noticing them more. I started paying closer attention to his tone, his words, and the way he'd sometimes look at me, almost like I was annoying him. Suddenly, I felt hyper-aware of everything I was saying, afraid he'd twist it into something else or take offense. It felt like I was watching myself from the outside, like I'd become this unwanted presence in my own relationship. We'd be sitting next to each other, maybe watching a movie or scrolling on our phones, but I'd feel so alone. I could practically feel this barrier between us, this invisible wall that seemed to rise up higher with each passing day. Even when I reached over to hold his hand, he'd hold it for a minute and then pull away, reaching for his phone or scratching his neck, as if the contact was an afterthought. It wasn't always like this. When we first started dating, he was warm, attentive. He'd ask about my day, listen to my rambling stories about work, laugh at my bad jokes, and somehow make me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. But now, everything felt one-sided. Conversations were shallow, almost transactional. When I'd ask how he was, he'd shrug or give a quick, dismissive response. There was this distance that I couldn't bridge, no matter how hard I tried. In an attempt to understand, I started doing some research. I figured maybe he and I just had different communication styles or backgrounds. He mentioned before that his family wasn't as big on talking things out, while my family always dissected every little thing. I tried to empathize with him, to give him the benefit of the doubt, telling myself he wasn't trying to hurt me. But the more I tried to meet him halfway, the more it felt like he was stepping back. I'd bring something up gently like, "Hey, I felt a bit brushed off when you said X was Z," and he'd immediately go on the defensive. His responses would be short and clipped, like he'd already made up his mind that I was just being difficult or overly sensitive. After a while, I started avoiding bringing anything up altogether. It was exhausting, always feeling like I was the only one trying to keep the peace. I began to feel more like a burden than a partner, afraid that I'd say the wrong thing and drive him further away. Topics that used to be light and easy became minefields. Anything from our future plans to what we'd eat for dinner. It was like I could feel this silent tension building between us, a tension I could barely stand but couldn't bring myself to address anymore. One night, after yet another dinner where the silence between us was thicker than the meal on our plates, I decided I couldn't keep letting things fester. I gathered all the courage I could, took a deep breath, and asked if we could have a serious talk. He sighed and set his fork down, already looking defeated. "What is it now?" he asked, sounding more tired than curious. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked anyway. I just feel like we're not connecting anymore. Like everything I say or do annoys you, and I don't know why. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if he didn't understand the words coming out of my mouth. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, the silence stretching too long, making my stomach twist. And finally he shrugged. "I don't know what you want me to say." That one sentence felt like a punch to the gut. I had poured my heart out, and all I got was indifference in return. My eyes stung, but I swallowed the tears down, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want you to say you care. I want you to say that you see how hard this is for me, for us." He rolled his eyes, which only made the frustration boil over. "You're always looking for problems," he muttered under his breath. That hit harder than I thought it would. Always looking for problems? I was trying so hard to keep us from falling apart, but he saw it as nagging. All those times I'd held back, all those things I'd swallowed, they suddenly felt pointless. "I'm not looking for problems. I'm trying to fix them. But I can't be the only one who cares enough to try," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If you don't want to put in the effort, just tell me. Don't keep me here, hanging on a hope that maybe one day we'll figure it out." He didn't say a word, just sat there, looking at me with this unreadable expression. And in that silence, something inside me broke. I realized that no matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I wanted to make this work, I couldn't do it alone. After that, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. We started avoiding each other, slipping back into the routine of two people who shared a space but not a life. I began sleeping on the edge of the bed, curling up as small as I could, trying to make myself invisible. I felt trapped in a relationship with someone who couldn't or wouldn't see me, no matter how hard I tried to be seen. I don't know where to go from here. Part of me wants to believe we can fix it, that there's some magical way to break down the walls between us and finally connect the way we used to. But another part of me is starting to think that maybe this is just how it's going to be. Maybe we're two people who can't understand each other, no matter how hard we try. So, I'm asking, is it possible to fix communication issues in a situation like this? How do you reach someone who doesn't seem to want to reach back? When I slept with my best friend, it felt like the culmination of something we'd both been circling for years. There were always little sparks, quick glances that lingered, hugs that seemed to mean more than just friendship. But we both stubbornly ignored them, pretending we were just great friends. No labels, no drama, just two people who got each other. Until one night, fueled by a few too many glasses of wine and the weight of our own unsaid thoughts, we finally crossed that line. I still remember that first kiss, a hesitant, almost questioning move like, are we really doing this? But once we started, there was no turning back. We didn't talk about it afterward, just went back to pretending, but now with this unspoken agreement between us that we'd occasionally just be together in that way. It was thrilling at first, like sharing a secret no one else could understand. He'd text me late at night, a simple "you up?" and I'd know exactly what he meant. It felt dangerous and safe all at once, and I told myself that it was fine, that we were adults and we could keep our friendship intact. But as the weeks went by, things shifted. I found myself reading into every little thing he did. Was he sitting closer to me? Was he holding eye contact just a bit longer? My brain, like it was on autopilot, kept picking up on every tiny detail, my emotions rewiring everything between us into something more romantic. It was a trap, one I walked into willingly, because I wanted to believe he felt the same way. I convinced myself that he just didn't know how to say it, that he was waiting for the right moment. But that moment never came. Instead, he started talking about another woman he'd met, someone he was really into, and I felt this pit open in my stomach. I'd been bracing myself for it, but it didn't make it any easier. I wanted to tell him right then and there that he didn't need anyone else because we were already perfect for each other. But I didn't. I laughed it off, told him she sounded great, and watched as the thing I'd been building in my mind crumbled into pieces. He began seeing her more seriously, and soon enough, our late-night texts and impromptu meetups dwindled. I was still his best friend, but now I was his best friend who'd been to bed with him and didn't know how to go back to just being the buddy he saw me as. I kept hoping he'd realize what he was losing, that one day he'd show up on my doorstep, realizing it was me he wanted all along. But the reality was much colder and much quieter. I eventually distanced myself, telling him I was busy with work, making excuses not to hang out as much. It was painful, and I missed him with every part of me, but I couldn't bear to see him with someone else, couldn't stomach the idea of being just friends again. He noticed, of course, asked if something was wrong. I made up a story about needing space, about sorting through things, and he respected that. Part of me hated that he respected it, because it made me feel like he was letting me go so easily. Months later, he showed up unexpectedly at my place, asking why things felt different. I looked at him, all those words that had been stuck in my throat for months right there, begging to be said. But I couldn't. I couldn't break the illusion of friendship that we'd built over years, even if it meant lying to myself. So I told him I was just going through a rough patch, that I needed to focus on myself, and he nodded like he understood. And maybe he did, or maybe he just didn't want to see what was right in front of him. That was the last time we really connected. He drifted further away, and I did too, like two people on opposite sides of a river. It's been years now, and we're still in touch, but it's not the same. Sometimes, I still wonder what would have happened if I just told him the truth, if I'd been brave enough to say what I really felt. But then I remember that night, and how clear it was, the line between love and friendship that we crossed but could never stay on the other side of. And maybe, in some twisted way, that's for the best. The first time I met Mark, I was absolutely smitten. He just finished up a charity event, of all things, and was wearing this ridiculous suit with a slightly crooked bow tie that he hadn't even noticed. I remember thinking how endearing it was that he seemed so comfortable, so unaware of himself in this refreshing way. He was charming and warm, his laugh infectious. He asked me questions and actually listened to the answers, not the glazed-over nodding you sometimes get on first dates. And he was passionate. He spoke about his work with kids and community programs, his dream to start his own nonprofit one day. It wasn't a rehearsed spiel. It was genuine, and I remember thinking, wow, this is what I've been looking for. The green flags were waving from every angle. Attentive, ambitious, empathetic. My past relationships have been riddled with detached or unreliable partners. So meeting someone so open and so involved was intoxicating. He made me feel seen and valued in a way that felt novel. My friends were impressed too. They told me I'd found someone special and solid, like he was the kind of guy who wouldn't just disappear or let things fizzle out. He made grand, romantic gestures, sure, but he also remembered the little things like how I took my coffee or my favorite bands. We were about 4 months in when he met my closest friend, Emily. She was cautious but kind, and I could tell she was trying to like him for my sake. After we all had dinner, Emily pulled me aside, a concerned look flashing across her face. She hesitated but then said, I like him, but there's just something about the way he talks about other people that feels a bit intense. She referenced a few stories Mark had told, ones where he'd had fallouts with friends and family members, and how in every story he painted himself as the wrong party, the one who had to set boundaries because people always end up taking advantage of him. I shrugged her comments off, thinking, who doesn't have a little baggage? Besides, the way he described those situations made it sound like he was a person who valued loyalty and respect. Maybe I was even a little defensive. He's just passionate, I'd said, brushing off her concern. Emily looked unconvinced, but let it drop. The first red flag came up a couple of months later, but it was small, or so I thought. We were at a party, and a guy from my college days came up to say hello. I introduced him to Mark, expecting nothing of it. But later, when we were on our way home, Mark was uncharacteristically quiet, and I asked him if everything was okay. He finally said, I don't know, it just seems weird that he was so friendly with you. Like, he was looking at you a little too intensely. He gave a short, awkward laugh, but there was a hint of seriousness underneath. At first, I reassured him, told him it was nothing. He seemed to accept it, but it left me with a strange feeling. This was the first time I'd seen that side of him, jealous, insecure. But I told myself that everyone has moments like that, and honestly, a little jealousy could even be a sign that he cared. I could rationalize it, so I brushed it aside. It didn't take long before other, slightly unsettling things started to crop up. He'd check in on where I was more often, not always in a way that seemed concerning, but in a way that gradually felt stifling. He'd say things like, "I just worry because I care so much about you," or "I don't want you to be in situations where people might take advantage of you." It was subtle, and it always came wrapped in the language of concern, so it was easy to accept without really questioning it. Still, a tiny part of me started to feel uneasy. Then came the moments when he would occasionally snap over minor things, like me making last-minute plans or deciding to work late. He'd say he felt left out or unimportant, like he was my second priority. Those accusations stung. I find myself apologizing, overcompensating, trying to make it clear he was my top priority. But as I tried harder, he just seemed to expect more. My once carefree nights with friends turned into explanations and negotiations with him. It started feeling less like concern and more like control. One night, he crossed a line. I'd gone out with a few colleagues after work, just a casual hangout, and he hadn't seemed to mind when I told him my plans earlier in the day. But when I got home, he was waiting up, visibly irritated. I asked him if something was wrong, and his expression turned cold. He started going off about how he was sick of being left in the dark, how it made him feel like I didn't care enough to keep him in the loop. At this point, something snapped in me. "Mark, I told you where I was. You knew my plans. Why are you making this a problem?" I said, my voice shaking with both anger and disbelief. His expression softened, and he quickly tried to smooth things over, saying he'd just been worried. But there was no taking back what he'd said or how he'd said it. I saw a flash of anger, one I hadn't seen before, and I realized this wasn't a one-off reaction. It was a pattern I'd been ignoring. That night, I lay awake, replaying our relationship in my head, picking apart every red flag I'd brushed aside. I thought about the way he had distanced me from certain friends, the times he'd made me feel guilty for wanting my own space. The scales tipped, and for the first time, I saw his passion and concern as something different, as control. It was like waking up from a dream where everything was slightly off, but you were too close to see it. Finally, I ended things. It wasn't easy, and he didn't take it well. He called me, texted me, accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. The person I'd once thought so highly of, the person I defended and fought for, was showing a side I'd ignored for too long. Now, I find myself questioning everything. How many of those green flags were genuine? And how many were just well-placed illusions? Was he always this way, or did I just bring it out in him somehow? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But here's what I want to ask you, Reddit. How do you know when a green flag is genuine and when it's just a red flag in disguise? How do you know when it's time to trust your gut or listen to the people who care about you? Ethan and I had been together for just over 2 years. It felt like a dream at first, one of those effortless fairy tale romances. We met through mutual friends at a party, and there was an immediate spark between us. I remember how we'd spent that entire night talking, completely wrapped up in each other, oblivious to everything else. Our first few months together were incredible, filled with spontaneous road trips, late-night conversations, and endless laughter. We couldn't get enough of each other, and it felt like I had finally found someone who understood me in a way nobody else ever had. I used to think we were unbreakable, that what we had was different. Ethan had this way of making me feel like the only person in the room, even in a crowd. He was attentive, always remembering the small things like my favorite coffee order or the way I scrunch my nose when I'm thinking too hard. We shared inside jokes and made plans to travel, to build a life together. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. At first, it was little things. He started coming home later than usual, which he explained as a new project at work that was taking up his time. He'd always been a bit of a workaholic, so I try not to read too much into it. But then he started canceling our plans last minute, saying he was just too exhausted or needed a night to himself. That was new for him. He'd always been so excited about spending time together. but I reasoned that maybe he was just stressed and didn't want to burden me with it. Then there was his phone. Ethan had never been secretive about his phone before. In fact, we often shared funny memes and showed each other pictures. But now he kept it face down on the table, and when it buzzed, he'd casually slide it into his pocket. If I asked about it, he'd brush it off, saying it was work stuff or just junk notifications. I wanted to believe him, so I did, at least for a while. But the distance kept growing. His warmth, his affection, they started to feel less consistent, like he was there with me physically, but not really present. When we'd go out to dinner or even just sit on the couch together, he'd seem distracted, his eyes wandering or his responses shorter than usual. Sometimes I'd catch him looking away, as if lost in thought, and when I asked him about it, he'd just say he was tired or had something on his mind. I knew relationships had ups and downs, and part of me kept telling myself that this was just one of those down moments, that it would pass. Still, a small voice inside me kept whispering that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, to push down my insecurities and not make a big deal out of what could be nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling me. My mind started racing, playing out scenarios I didn't even want to consider. Was he losing interest? Was he seeing someone else? I hated feeling suspicious. I didn't want to be that person. But at the same time, I couldn't pretend I didn't notice the shift between us. I spent weeks going back and forth in my head, debating whether I should say something or just let it play out. I didn't want to seem paranoid or needy, but I also didn't want to ignore my gut. Eventually, the tension became too much to bear. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, so I decided to confront him. One evening, after another night of him coming home late and barely speaking to me, I finally broke. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, a distance that felt much wider than just a few feet. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the words forming in my throat, but I hesitated, afraid of what his reaction might be. "Ethan," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can we talk?" He looked up from his phone, surprised. "Sure. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I feel like things have been different between us lately. I can't shake this feeling that you're pulling away. He frowned, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "I've just been busy with work. You know how it is." "I know, but it feels like more than that. You've been distant, Ethan. It's like you're here, but not really here. You don't even look at me the same way anymore." He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "That's not fair. I'm just tired, okay? Work has been a lot, and I don't always have the energy to be the same way I was before. It's nothing personal." I wanted to believe him, but his tone was defensive, almost dismissive. It felt like he was brushing off my concerns, like my feelings didn't matter. I pressed on, hoping he'd understand. "I get that work is demanding, and I'm not trying to make this harder for you. I need to know if we're okay. If we're still okay." There was a long pause, and I could feel my stomach twisting as I waited for him to respond. Finally, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't know what you want me to say. I'm doing the best I can right now." His words felt like a slap, so cold and detached. It was as if he had built a wall between us, one I couldn't break through. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see how much his indifference was hurting me. "Do you even want to be in this relationship anymore?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He looked at me then, really looked at me, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes I couldn't decipher. "Of course I do. I don't know what you want from me, really. All I wanted was the truth, but it was clear he wasn't ready to give it to me. Maybe he didn't even know what he was feeling himself, or maybe he just wasn't willing to let me in. Either way, his reluctance left me with more questions than answers. I sat there, the silence between us heavy and suffocating, wondering where we went from here. I wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch, something we could work through if we tried. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that the person I fell in love with was slipping away from me, bit by bit. I don't know what comes next. Maybe we'll find our way back to each other, or maybe this is the beginning of the end. I wish I had a clearer sense of what to do, of whether it's worth fighting for, or if I'm just clinging to a memory of what we once had. Is it possible to save a relationship when everything suddenly changes? Has anyone been through something like this and managed to make it work? Because right now, I feel like I'm holding on to something that's already slipping through my finger. When I first met Nate, I didn't think much would come of it. He was friendly and charming, sure, but I'd been on enough dates to know that charm was sometimes just a surface thing. He was cute, though, and when he asked me out for dinner the second time, I figured, why not? It was the little things he did that started to draw me in. We were walking back from dinner when it started to rain, and without missing a beat, Nate pulled off his hoodie and handed it to me. I was surprised more by the fact he didn't try to be slick about it. It wasn't that sort of "I want you to think I'm the good guy" gesture. It felt genuine. Green flag number one, right? And there were more. On our third date, I mentioned in passing that I was trying to read more, but never seemed to have time for it. The next time we met up, he handed me this beat-up copy of East of Eden. He said it was his favorite book and that he thought I'd like it. The edges were all frayed, like he'd read it 100 times. It felt personal, like he was sharing a piece of himself with me. It was thoughtful in a way that took me off guard, and it made me see him in a new light. I found myself wondering if this guy might actually be different. As we kept seeing each other, he did these small things that made me feel like I was better, more capable, even kinder than I usually felt. I've always been shy about cooking, but he made it sound fun, like an adventure rather than a chore. He'd come over with bags of ingredients, and we'd make a mess of my tiny kitchen, laughing and trying recipes neither of us had ever attempted. On weekends, we'd go hiking, something I'd always wanted to do, but never found the motivation for. With him, it was easy. He brought out a side of me I liked. But around month 4, things started to shift in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first time I noticed something, I just posted a photo from a work outing, and one of my male coworkers commented. Nate saw it when I showed him the picture, and his face changed just a bit. He was quiet, said something like, "Nice that you're making friends," but he said it with this odd edge. Later that night, he asked if the guy commented on a lot of my photos. I shrugged it off, explaining it was a group thing and we were all just hanging out. He laughed it off, but a couple of days later, he made a joke about how I was getting lots of attention these days. It was said lightly, in that way you're supposed to laugh along with, but something about it felt off. I chalked it up to a bad mood or a fleeting insecurity. I mean, everyone has those, right? Over time, there were other little things too. Like, he'd sometimes comment on the way I dressed when I was going out without him, even if it was just with friends. "I get it, that's what you're wearing." Or, "Why are you dressing up so much?" It was subtle, never overtly disapproving, more like he was just surprised, but I could tell he didn't like it. At first, I started adjusting what I wore to avoid his comments, which in retrospect should have been a red flag. But at the time, I brushed it off as him just being, I don't know, protective. There was one day, though, when things shifted. We'd gone out for drinks with some of my friends, and one of them, a guy I'd known since college, playfully bumped my shoulder when I made a joke. Nate got quiet, and his jaw tensed in that way that told me he was biting back words. Later, as we left the bar, he pulled me aside and asked, "Are you sure there's nothing going on with him?" It was the first time he'd outright questioned me like that, and I remember feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I'd never given him a reason to distrust me. He quickly apologized, saying he just got jealous because he cared about me so much, but the way he looked at me after made me feel guilty, like maybe I had done something wrong. I told myself it was just him caring deeply, that it was maybe even a green flag in a weird way. Maybe he loved me enough to be afraid of losing me. Things kept escalating slowly, quietly. He'd check my phone as a joke or just to see who I was chatting with. And while he never demanded to read messages, he'd scan over my shoulder if I was texting around him. He'd make remarks if I went too long without replying to him, even during work hours. "You're not too busy to just say hi, right?" It was said with a smile, but I could tell he meant it. Then came the pivotal moment. We were at his place, and I got a text from my sister asking if I was free to chat later. Without thinking, I replied with a quick "sure," but when I looked up, Nate was watching me with this cold expression. "Why don't you ever text me back that quickly?" he asked. I was startled, laughed a bit, and tried to brush it off, but he didn't let it go. For the next hour, he went on and on about how he didn't feel prioritized, how he felt like I was always putting other people before him. It was a long, tense argument, with him saying things I never thought I'd hear from someone who was supposed to care about me. That night, something in me broke. For the first time, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. All those small things, I'd brushed off over the months started to click into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I lay awake next to him, feeling like I didn't recognize the person beside me anymore. How had I let it get to this point? I spent the next few weeks oscillating between doubt and guilt. Was I overreacting? Wasn't it normal for people to feel jealous or insecure sometimes? But then I'd remember the tension in his voice, the way he'd scrutinize me, the uneasy feeling that had become almost constant. I missed the version of him I'd thought I knew, the guy who made me try new things, who shared his favorite book with me like it was a piece of himself. So here I am, asking you all, how do you know when red flags outweigh green flags? When do you decide that the good moments can't justify the bad ones? And is it ever worth giving things another shot when everything feels so mixed? There was a certain thrill in how unexpected it all was. I just planned a night out with some friends, a little break from the weekly grind. Nothing serious, just drinks, dancing, maybe a few laughs. But as soon as I entered that bar, something in the air felt different. It was loud, packed, and full of energy. As we settled near the bar, I noticed him across the room, a guy with a confident smile and an easy demeanor that drew me in immediately. He noticed me too, and the moment our eyes met, I felt a spark, that electric jolt that rarely happens but feels so intoxicating when it does. We danced, laughed, and flirted, caught up in the heat of the moment. I felt myself getting lost in it, forgetting where I was, who was around, and just letting go of everything except the feeling. It was exhilarating, freeing, a kind of rush I hadn't felt in years. After a while, we ended up outside, away from the noise, sharing that intense, heart-pounding kiss that's both soft and full of promises you know you probably won't keep. It was one of those whirlwind nights where reality slips away and you're left suspended in the excitement. He invited me back to his place, and in that moment, I didn't even hesitate. I felt so alive, and saying yes felt like the most natural thing in the world. We got to his place, and everything moved fast. We laughed, talked, shared pieces of our lives, and then, well, things got intimate. It was one of those nights that felt like a dream, raw and passionate, where nothing else exists but two people caught up in each other. But the morning after was different. The early light hit, and I felt a strange mix of elation and unease. I glanced over at him, now just a stranger beside me. In that light, the adventure of the night before faded, replaced with questions that felt heavier than the thrill. Was this really what I wanted? I felt a pang of loneliness, even as I lay beside someone who just hours before had felt like the perfect stranger. For a moment, I thought back to how I got here. I've always enjoyed casual encounters, or at least the idea of them. They're thrilling, freeing, and uncomplicated, or so I thought. But lying there in the quiet of the morning, I realized I wanted something more than just a fleeting connection. The night had been amazing, yes, but now it felt a little empty, like I'd tasted something incredible only to be left unsatisfied. After a few minutes, I quietly slipped out of bed, dressed, and made my way to the door. He was still asleep, and I figured a goodbye wasn't necessary. It was casual, right? No streams, no commitments. Yet, as I walked out, a part of me hoped he'd wake up, maybe ask for my number, suggest we meet again. But he didn't. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was alone. I spent the rest of that day replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of why it felt so different from other hookups. In the past, I'd always been able to leave without a second thought, chalk it up to experience, and move on. But this time, something in me shifted. It wasn't regret, exactly, but more a realization of what I was truly seeking. By that evening, the excitement of the night had faded, leaving me with a hollow feeling I couldn't quite shake. I thought about my patterns, about how often I'd thrown myself into these intense, fleeting connections hoping they'd fill something, only to end up feeling more alone each time. It's strange, but there's a kind of loneliness that can come even when you're wrapped in someone else's arms. I started questioning if casual hookups were really what I wanted anymore. The night had been thrilling, yes, but the emptiness that followed made me realize that what I was really craving was something deeper, something lasting. It's not that I suddenly hated the idea of casual encounters, but I could see how they no longer served me the way they once did. That realization hit hard. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle the casual scene, someone who wasn't looking for commitment or strings. I had even convinced myself that freedom was what I truly wanted. But lying there alone in my bed that night, I felt something else creeping in, a desire for connection, for someone who'd be there in the morning, who'd want to share more than just a night. The next day, I reached out to a few friends, wanting to hear their experiences, see if anyone else had felt this shift. And what surprised me was how many of them could relate. They talked about their own wild nights, the highs and lows, the thrill followed by the crash. One friend put it best: casual can be fun until it starts to feel empty. Then it's just a reminder of what you don't have. That stuck with me. I realized I wasn't alone in this feeling, that maybe this was just a part of growing up, a shift from seeking thrills to seeking something real. Since then, I've been more intentional about who I spend my time with. I'm still open to fun and adventure, but now I'm looking for more than just a fleeting spark. I want that connection, the kind that doesn't leave you feeling hollow when the night is over. Maybe I'll find it, maybe I won't, but I know I won't settle for less than what I truly want. This wild night didn't just change how I see casual hookups. It changed how I see myself and what I want from the connections I make. Recently, I caught myself feeling like we were living on different planets. What used to connect us now feels foreign. Every day, it seems like we're growing further apart, and the idea of breaking up no longer seems impossible. But even just writing that feels like betrayal, like admitting something I've been denying for a long time. For so many years, I thought we were solid. Sure, we had our rough patches, but I used to believe that we'd always find our way back to each other. Then last Tuesday happened. It wasn't anything dramatic, no explosive fight, no betrayal. We were eating takeout Thai on the couch. One of those lazy meals where we used to talk for hours about our dreams or joke about how we'd become that couple with the matching sweats and predictable routines. But this time, the silence just hung there. I remember looking over and realizing I had no idea what he was thinking, and he didn't look like he wanted to share either. For the first time, I felt like I was having dinner with a stranger, not my partner. I wanted to reach out, ask him what was on his mind, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that I wouldn't like his answer, or worse, that he didn't even have one to give. The days after that were worse. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, wondering if I was overthinking things or if I'd finally seen the cracks we'd been hiding. I kept glancing over at him, trying to catch his eye, waiting for a sign that he was feeling the same distance. But he seemed content to go through the motions, polite, distant, almost as if he was a guest in his own home. I began noticing the subtle ways we'd both checked out. The way he'd stop texting me during the day, or how we'd sit in separate rooms in the evening. Conversations felt forced, and every silence felt loaded, like we were tiptoeing around something we were both too scared to say. The worst part was the confusion. How do we go from inseparable to whatever this was? I thought about our history, the years we'd shared, and the way I'd always believed we'd grow old together. And yet, here I was, feeling more alone with him than I'd ever felt by myself. I'd spend hours analyzing every moment, asking myself if I was just going through a rough patch or if this was what the end looked like. I'd remember the warmth we used to share, the inside jokes, the way he'd surprise me with little gestures. Those memories were like ghosts now, and I was clinging to them as if they could somehow bring us back to life. One night, after another silent dinner, I finally broke. I couldn't pretend anymore. I looked over at him, took a deep breath, and said, "Can we talk?" The words felt heavy, like I was pulling the first thread of something that would soon unravel completely. He looked up surprised, maybe a little wary. "Sure," he said, putting his fork down. I didn't even know where to start. All these feelings had been tangled up inside me for weeks, maybe months, and now that I had his attention, my mind went blank. Do you ever feel like we're just existing?" I asked, hoping he'd understand what I meant without me having to spell it out. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah, Ido." That simple acknowledgement hit me like a punch. Part of me had been hoping he'd say I was overthinking, that we'd just been busy or stressed, and that things would go back to normal soon. But hearing him admit it, hearing that he felt the same emptiness, confirmed everything I'd been dreading. I don't know what happened to us, I said, my voice shaky. It's like we just drifted, and now we're both here, but we're not together. He nodded slowly, not meeting my eyes. I think I've been afraid to admit it, he said. I didn't want to believe we'd let it get to this point. But you're right. I don't feel the way I used to. There it was. The truth, hanging between us like a wall we couldn't climb over. We both sat there, letting the weight of it sink in. It was a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. Finally saying the things we'd been holding back, even though they hurt more than I could have imagined. We talked for hours that night, unpacking years of feelings, memories, disappointments. There were no accusations, no blame, just a quiet acknowledgement that somewhere along the way, we'd lost each other. By the end of it, we were both exhausted, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, barely looking at each other. We knew what we had to do, even if neither of us could bring ourselves to say it. The next few days were surreal. We'd agreed to start looking for separate places, but actually putting that plan into action felt like a bad dream. I'd catch myself instinctively reaching out to him, whether it was to share a funny video or ask him to pick up milk, only to remember that he wouldn't be there much longer. Our routines, the little habits we built together, suddenly felt hollow, like echoes of a life that wasn't mine anymore. The first night after he left, I sat alone in the apartment, surrounded by boxes of his things, and felt this strange mix of sadness and freedom. It was like my life had been emptied out, leaving this quiet space where he used to be. I missed him, or at least I missed the idea of us. But there was also a tiny part of me that felt relieved, like I could finally breathe. In the weeks that followed, I stumbled through the motions of my new reality. I took up cooking again, experimenting with recipes I'd always wanted to try, but never had the time or energy for. I started going for long walks in the evenings, listening to podcasts and letting myself enjoy the quiet. It was strange, realizing I could build a life on my own, one that didn't revolve around someone else. But every now and then, a memory would hit me, a song, a joke, something that reminded me of him. And the sadness would creep back in, lingering like a dull ache. Some days, I feel like I'm moving forward, and others, it's like I'm still sitting on that couch, replaying that last conversation. I'm learning to be okay with both, to accept that healing isn't a straight line. Part of me wonders if we could have saved it, if we just tried harder or held on a little longer. But another part of me knows that sometimes letting go is the only way to grow. So here I am, trying to figure out who I am without him and asking myself what comes next. For those who've been through this kind of breakup or divorce, how did you deal with the pain? Did you find anything valuable in the experience? I could really use some advice, or maybe just a reminder that it gets easier.